Today I'm going to read the book The Ickabog by J.K. Rowling. It is a book with a bunch of short little stories in it. So in each video I will be reading one of the short stories as shown in the table of the context. So if you want, you can just search through the table of contents, see which one you like, and then choose that video to listen. Foreword. Below is the foreword of J.K. Rowling. The idea for the Ickabog came to me a long time ago. The word Ickabog derives from Ickabog, meaning no glory, or the glory has departed. I think you'll understand why I chose the name once you've read the story, which deals with themes that have always interested me. What do the monsters we conjure tell us about ourselves? What must happen for evil to get a grip on a person or on a country? And what does it take to defeat it? Why do people choose to believe lies even on scant or non-existent evidence? The Ickabog was written in fits and starts between Harry Potter books. The story never underwent any serious modifications. It always started with poor Mrs. Stovetail's death, and it always ended, well, I won't say how, in case you are coming to it for the first time. I read the story aloud to my two youngest children when they were very young, but I never finished it, much to the frustration of Mackenzie, whose favorite story it was. After I finished Harry Potter books, I took a 5-year break, and when I decided not to publish a children's book next, the Ickabog went up into the attic, still unfinished. There it stayed for over a decade, and there it would probably be still if the COVID-19 pandemic hadn't happened and millions of children hadn't been stuck at home, unable to attend school or meet their friends. That's when I had the idea of putting the story online for free and asking children to illustrate it. Down from the attic it came in a very dusty box of typed and handwritten papers, and I set to work. My now teenagers, who'd been the Ickabog's very first audience, sat and listened to a nightly chapter once I'd nearly finished. Every now and then they'd ask why I'd cut something they used to like, and naturally I reinstated everything they missed, astounded by how much they remembered. In addition to my very supportive family, I went to thank those who helped me bring the Ickabog online in such a short space of time. My editor, Arthur Levine, and Ruth Altimes, James McKnight of the Blair Partnership, my management team, Rebecca Salt, Nikki Stonehill, and Mark Hutchinson, and my agent, Neil Blair. It really was a Herculean effort of all concerned, and I couldn't be more grateful. I'd also like to thank every single children and the occasional adults who submitted children pictures for the illustration competition. Looking through the artwork has been a joy, and I know I'm far alone in marveling at the talent on display. I'd love to think the Ickabog gave some future artist and illustrator their first public exposure. Returning to the land of Cornucopia and finishing what I started so long ago had been one of the most rewarding experiences of my writing life. All that remains to say is that I hope you enjoy reading the story as much as I enjoy writing it. Signed, J.K. Rowling, July 2020. Chapter 1. King Fred the Fearless. Once upon a time, there was a tiny country called Cornucopia, which had been ruled for centuries by a long line of fair-haired kings. The king at the time of which I write was called King Fred the Fearless. He denounced the fearless bit himself on the morning of his coronation, partly because it sounded nice with Fred, but also because he'd once managed to catch and kill a wasp all by himself, if you didn't count the 5 footmen and a butt boy. Anyways, King Fred the Fearless came to the throne on a huge wave of popularity. He had lovely yellow curls, a fine sweeping mustache, and looking magnificent in the tight breeches, velvet doublets, and ruffled shirts that rich men wore at the time. Fred was said to be generous, smiled and waved whenever anyone caught sight of him, and looked awfully handsome in the portraits that were distributed throughout the kingdom, to be hung in town walls. The people of Cornucopia were most happy with their new king, and many thought he'd end up being ever better at the job than his father, Richard the Righteous, whose teeth, though nobody had liked to mention it at the time, were rather crooked. King Fred was secretly relieved to find out how easy it was to rule Cornucopia. In fact, the country seemed to run itself. Nearly everybody had lost of foods, the merchants made pots of gold, and Fred's advisor took care of any little problem that arose. All that was left for Fred to do was beam at his subjects whenever he went out in his carriage and go hunting 5 times a week with his 2 best friends, Lord Spittleworth and Lord Flapoon. Spittleworth and Flapoon had large estates of their own in the country, but they found it much cheaper and more amusing to live at the palace with the king, eating his food, hunting his stags, and making sure that the king didn't get too fond of any of the beautiful ladies at court. They had no wish to see Fred married, because a queen might spoil all their fun. Duh. For a time, Fred had seemed rather like Lady Islanda, who was as stark and beautiful as Fred was fair and handsome. But Spittleworth had persuaded Fred that she was far too serious and bookish for the country to love her as queen. Fred didn't know that Lord Spittleworth had a grudge against Lady Islanda. He'd once asked her to marry him, but she turned him down. Lord Spittleworth was very thin, cunning, and clever. His friend Flapoon was ruddy-faced, and so enormous that it required 6 men to heave him onto his massive chestnut horse. Though not as clever as Spittleworth, Flapoon was still far sharper than the king, that's for sure. Both lords were expert at flattery and pretending to be astonished by how good Fred was at everything, from riding to tiddlewinks. If Spittleworth had a particular talent, it was persuading the king to do things that suited Spittleworth. And if Flapoon had a gift, it was for convincing the king that nobody on earth was as loyal to the king as his 2 best friends. Fred thought Spittleworth and Platoon were jolly good caps. They urged him to hold fancy parties, elaborate picnics, and sumptuous banquet, because Cornucopia was famous, far beyond its borders, for its food. Each of his cities was known for a different kind, and each was at the very best in the world. The capital of Cornucopia, Chouxville, lay in the south of the country, and was surrounded by acres of orchards, fields of shimmering golden wheat, and emerald green grass on which pure white dairy cows grazed. The cream, flour, and fruit produced by the farmers here was then given to the exceptional bakers of Chouxville, who made pastries. Think, if you please, of the most delicious cake or cookie you have ever tasted. Well, let me tell you that they'd have been downright ashamed to serve that in Chouxville. Unless a grown man's eye filled with tears of pleasure as he bit into the Chouxville pastry, it was deemed a failure and never made again. The bakery windows of Chouxville were piled high with delicacies such as maidens' dreams, fairies' cradles, and most famous of all, hopes of heaven, which were so exquisitely, painfully delicious that they were served for special occasions, and everybody cried for joy as they ate them. King Porphyrio of neighboring Pluritania had already sent King Fred a letter, offering him the choice of any of his daughter's hand in marriage in exchange for a lifetime supply of hopes of heaven. But Spittleworth had advised Fred to laugh in the Puritanian ambassador's face.
His daughters are nowhere near pretty enough to exchange for hopes of heaven, sire,
said Spittleworth. To the north of Chouxville lay more green fields and clear, sparkling rivers, where jet-black cows and happy pink pigs were raised. These in turn served the twin cities of Kurdsburg and Bayronstown, which were separated from each other by an arching stone bridge over the main river of Cornucopia, the Fluma, where brightly colored barges bore goods from one end of the kingdom to another. Kurdsburg was famous for its cheeses, huge white wheels, dense orange cannibals, big crumbly blue-vined barrels, and little baby cream cheeses smoother than velvet. Bayronstown was celebrated for its smoked and honey-roasted hams, its cider bacons, its spicy sausages, its melting beef steaks, and its venison pies. The savory fumes rising from the chimney of the red bricks Bayronstown stove mingled with the odorous tang wafting from the doorway of the Kurdsburg cheesemongers, and for 40 miles all around it was impossible not to salivate breathing in the delicious air. A few hours north of Kurdsburg and Bayronstown, you came upon acres of vineyards bearing grapes as large as eggs, each of them ripe and sweet and juicy. Journey onward for the rest of the day, and you reached the granite city of Jeroboam, famous for its wine. They said of the Jeroboam air that you could get tipsy simply walking its streets. The best vintage changed hands for thousands upon thousands of gold coins, and the Jeroboam wine merchants were some of the richest men in the kingdom. But a little north of Jeroboam, a strange thing happened. It was as though the magically rich land of Cornucopia had exhausted itself by producing the best grass, the best fruits, the best wheat in the world. Right at the northern tip came the place known as the Marshlands, and the only thing that grew there was some tasteless, rubbery mushroom and thin, dry grass. Only good enough to feed a few mangy sheep. The Marshlanders who tend the sheep didn't have the sleek, well-rounded, well-dressed appearance as the citizens of Jeroboam, Bayronstown, Kurdsburg, or Chouxville. They were gaunt and ragged. Their poorly nourished sheep never fetched good prices, either in Cornucopia or abroad. So very few Marshlanders ever got to taste the delights of Cornucopia wine, cheese, beef, or pastries. The most common dish in the marshlands were a greasy mutton broth, made of those sheep who were too old to sell. The rest of Cornucopia found the Marshlanders an odd bunch. Surely dirty and ill-tempered. They had rough voices, which the other Cornucopians imitated, making them sound like hoarse old sheep. Jokes were made that their manners and their simplicity. As far as the rest of the Cornucopia was concerned, the only memorable thing that had ever come out of Marshlands were the legend of the Ickabog.